Hi, I'm Moritz, and this is the Schrift.co website, a website showcasing the typefaces that I designed. And for this project, I'm serving up HTML5 via PHP on Apache, styling with CSS, preprocessed by SASS, and jQuery-based JavaScript. I'm also using Git for version control. The first step was to come up with a design, and I used Keynote to make some quick mock-ups very intuitively without thinking about it very much. I make as many variations as possible, and usually something crystallizes, and it's obvious which one is the best one. Next, I try to get a mock-up done as quickly as possible. Even though the website was planned as a PHP website from the start, which allows the building of the website, of the web pages dynamically, I usually do a quick HTML single-page mock-up to see if my ideas are working. I use brackets as my editor of choice because of the very nice live preview editing feature, which allows me to see changes in the browser as I make them in the code. Getting the header right and functioning in HTML was one of the most complicated and time-consuming aspects of this project. For this project, I wanted to use a CSS preprocessor, and I taught myself SASS. It's really very simple. It can be learned in just a few hours. A preprocessor makes the CSS more programmatic and allows for things like reusable code and variables and nesting of CSS. This makes the CSS more semantic. You can give colors names instead of hex codes, and it makes making changes more quick and more easy. I made the project responsive and mobile first from the start as well. I'm not a huge fan of frameworks like Bootstrap, which have like 4 or 5 different layouts. I usually think 2, maybe 3 are enough. In this project, I wanted to have a dedicated mobile view and then one for wider screens with just a few changes for very wide screens. So once this basic framework is up and running, I try to add the content to the website as quickly as possible, even if that content is yet unfinished. In my case, I was lucky to have pretty much finished content to work with from the start, so I could start thinking about the user experience right away. And one thing I wanted to do is make the header of the website stop scrolling and become fixed after a certain point on the page. And I implemented this with jQuery-based JavaScript. I am listening for the document's scroll top, the scroll position from the top of the page, and then at a certain point add certain classes or subtract certain classes accordingly. I'm also using JavaScript in the tryout page, in which we're listening to changes to our input controls and then updating the CSS styles of the text box, of the text area accordingly. I later also added a functionality to change the colors and contrast, again by adding and subtracting classes based on which ones are clicked. Because the content of each web page is very complex, I decided that I wanted to break it up into tabs. And I chose again against using Bootstrap or a different jQuery plugin to achieve this tabbing, and I wrote the code myself. Though I might turn that into a plugin later on myself, so I can reuse it in other projects. To also make this page work without JavaScript enabled, the content of the page is really one long scrolling page, and it's broken up into several HTML5 section elements. So without JavaScript, clicking on a link in the tab bar will simply scroll to that page, to that anchor tag, to that section on the page. With the JavaScript functionality enabled, though, it hides all the sections, except for the one that is associated with the link that we currently clicked. One downside of using JavaScript for navigation in general is the lack of history. When you click the back button of your browser, it will oftentimes go back to the previous page altogether and not the previous tab. And to prevent that from happening, I'm making use of the fact that clicking on a hash anchor tag on a website will change your URL and therefore making an entry in your browser's history. So the JavaScript that fires the actual tab change is not called when the link itself is clicked, but rather when the browser's URL changes. This makes the tab changing accessible via the browser's history, like the back and the forward buttons, and you can even bookmark it. The last problem that I then run into is when you click on a hash anchor tag, the browser wants to scroll the page to that ID, to that tag, and then leaving the user with a potentially confusing jump. To prevent this from happening, I actually removed all the ID targets in each sections with JavaScript, and then the target for the tabbed content is done with a class instead. In hindsight, I probably should have implemented this with a custom data attribute instead of classes, and I might change it to do that in the future. Other little things that I thought about in terms of the user experience was that the secondary navigation also becomes fixed after a certain point in the scrolling, and when we click a link in the footer, the page actually scrolls back to the top, and it does so smoothly without a jump. When you click on the Read More About Here link in the description, it takes you to the tab that says About, and I actually remove that link because since we're already there. The tab change from a long page, and if you're in a long page and you click on a tab change, it will take you back to the top so that you're not left on the bottom of a tab that you haven't read yet. And as I previously mentioned, I made this website PHP-based. In essence, instead of having 10 different HTML pages, all with nearly identical footers and headers and layouts, etc., we're just running a PHP script on our web server, which is running Apache in our case, which then dynamically builds the web pages instead of out of building blocks. And for this project, the programmatic challenges were to adjust the header based on the website that we're currently viewing. So when you click on the theory page, for example, it looks different than the about page than it looks on the Typefaces page. And we also needed to load different style sheets depending on which page we actually clicked. And we want rendered because this is how we load the web fonts and also the themes that are associated with each page. And the other challenge was to have PHP parse the URL. So instead of having a page address like schrift.co/index.php ? Page equals typefaces, we can simply have schrift.co/typefaces. And for this, I'm using PHP to parse the URL and extracting from it everything from the / on forward. And then we're using that as a variable to pass into a function that renders the page and that uses the template that corresponds to the name that we extracted. And to make it complete, I also modified the htaccess file, which configures our Apache web server to hide the index.php part of the URL and just gives us the simple, clean, and SEO-friendly URL. So that sums it up, I think, rather nicely. If you have any questions, you can feel free to click on the Contact Me page or click on the About page in this website, and I would hope and would like to see your comments on this. Thank you.